the June Astro Tours. My name is Jangli Zhang, and I'll be your host today. But I'm not the speaker, so the more interesting person today, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. The more interesting person today is Amaury. Amaury is a postdoc at the University of Toronto, and he is a planet hunter. It's not often that you can be an astronomer and a hunter at the same time, so I'm very envious of what he does. Amaury did his undergraduate studies at St. Andrews University, moved on to Geneva, and then MIT, and finally Toronto here recently this year. He'll be talking to you about planets, life on other planets, Genesis today. But I won't tell you about that because he will. Instead, what I will tell you is something interesting about Amaury. He's one of the most passionate people that I've met in astronomy. When he starts talking about his research, you feel like there's magic in the air. And maybe some of that magic is because he knows timing and all that exciting stuff that's to do with tango. So in his spare time, he tangos around. So I hope today you will tango with him throughout the exoplanet universe. Amaury.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Has life emerged elsewhere? Has there been another genesis? This talk is really about considering biology or life down here on Earth, but see it in an astronomical context. The reason to do so is multifold, but primarily we would like to understand how life emerged here on Earth. So astronomy acts really as a mirror. How did we come to being? That's what we will try to answer. Astronomy contains an essential piece in the understanding of our origins. We will go through three parts. First, setting the scene philosophically and historically. And then we will look a bit briefly at what we know about biological life on Earth and try to make inferences on what life elsewhere would look like. And then we'll move to exoplanets, try to see what happens and what we could deduce by observing those, try to understand whether we are alone in the cosmos or whether life, biological activity happens elsewhere. This will place life here in a much broader context than the one we used to, the one of our own little oasis of life. Before setting on, I'd like to present a definition. So the title included the word Genesis as a noun and not a name. This is something that can be conjugated in a plural. It's perfectly suited for a case and is a kind of a ticklish word that we like to use, or I like to use, to bring up this subject. So its origin, well, its meaning is really the origin of anything. It can be an idea. In our case, it will be an independent origin of life. So that on one place, life emerges pretty much ex nihilo, independently from another place. And we will see actually that there are competing theories to that. But first, why search for life elsewhere? Why do we actually care about this? And the reason is actually simple. Curiosity. It's only curiosity. And it's probably one of the oldest philosophical questions we have. Most cultural groups have a foundation myth that somehow explains the origin of life and of that particular cultural group. So it seems that it was something that certainly has made many people across ages question themselves. We want to know how it started. We want to know also if the Earth is special. Somehow, humans seem to be particularly fascinated by that question. It will always be special, like a home or first home can be, but in the term special, we'd like to see whether it has special characteristics that makes it stand out of the rest, or whether we are in a mundane place in an otherwise big universe. Those questions were raised pretty early, about 2.5 millennia ago. So this is a fresco in the Vatican, another kind of ticklish thought. You have in the center Socrates and Plato, and here on the side, this is Epicurus. And in the 3rd century before Christ, in a letter to Herodotus, he wrote, "Worlds of same nature are in infinite numbers, those similar to ours as much as those that are different." living beings, plants, and all visible things which could exist in such world may not in such another. A very modern thought, very far into the past, a thought that is actually echoed by several writers in Persia, India, and maybe even China. Those in writing, those that we actually still have a trace of. Although this is modern, this is actually a pretty archaic way of presenting things. You see that the vocabulary uses world and not planet. Back then, for the Greeks and most people on Earth, the Earth was not a planet, it was a world. The planets were moving dots of light into the sky. They were basically indistinguishable from stars. So in that one sentence, we have, a kind of relic of what a world used to be, something that was there, and maybe there was another world very well separated. Now we understand things better. We have a common universe made of planets, but the rest of the sentence flows the same way. So have those thoughts evolved? How are they expressed by contemporary science?
Excuse me, do you mind actually turn on the light a little bit? I might look way better.
Turn on or off? Down.
It's too bright.
Too bright? Okay.
I'll try to turn off these ones.
Yeah. Those ones and
A little bit louder.
okay. All right.
Do you want to use the
I guess so. Yeah. All right. I don't know if some of you know this picture. This is the furthest picture ever taken from Earth that reached us. This was taken at 40 times the distance between the Earth and the Sun by a probe called Voyager 1. It was sent in the 70s. The picture was taken in the 90s, the time to travel. And its title is actually pretty good. A very good text was written by Carl Sagan about that picture, the pale blue dot. It's a picture that spans tens of thousands of pixels, mostly dark, kind of family portrait of the solar system. And in one of those pixels, there is the Earth. And you can see it here on the top right. The Earth actually at that distance is 1/10 of the pixel in physical size, but its light fills this one pixel. And what we will look at today, considering life essentially on Earth, is really considering life in this vast universe, seeing it from afar. And our questions now do not differ too much from Epicurus, but are more, precise. We'd like to know how from the inanimate comes purpose. Is Darwinian evolution a universal phenomenon? Is the structure of life always the same? How frequently and how easily does life emerges? And could we create actually life ex nihilo if we would like to? We will go through a first historic overview so that you place a bit biological life, and then we'll talk about how astronomy can actually help us place, answers into the voids that we have in a story. So the solar system was born about 4.6 billion years ago, and 100 million years afterwards, the Earth was created. Then we think the Moon appeared from a collision about 100 million years afterwards, 4.4 billion years ago. And the earliest traces of life that we have are amongst the oldest rocks that have been found, in Greenland, I think, are about 3.8 billion years of age. In between, something kind of odd happened that has shaped the debate, maybe in good, maybe in bad. This is a picture of the Moon, and it serves to illustrate the late heavy bombardment. So when the astronauts went to the Moon, you see the orbits on the top right, and where they took pictures of the surface, you could count the number of craters. Then they collected samples there, and we could date the terrain. And we see that there is a sharp rise in the number of craters of impact on the Moon, about 4.1 to 3.9 billion years ago. And then 100 million years afterwards, the life emerges. What we think happened is that a great number of comets and asteroids have struck the inner solar system. The Moon was struck, but the Earth equally. Whether life actually emerged because of that bombardment is a big question. Maybe it's a coincidence also, because the surface may have been changed and all traces of life prior to that been hidden. And I'll show actually an argument in that favor. However, what we know is that life emerged pretty quickly. And that's a real wonder. Do you need an early Earth, something that is pretty hot, for life to emerge? Or could actually life still be generated as we speak today on Earth? If early, does it mean easy? And that's also where astronomy will help. How many planets, what fraction of the right planets possess life? So how did it start? What are the leading theories for that? The first that I will mention is not one that I support particularly, but one that makes sense in the current debate. We only know of one location for Earth, and that theory is quite makes actually life-bearing planets quite rare. So as long as we don't have another example, it still stands. Panspermia is this idea that life could travel from one planet to another. So the opposite idea than the one I'm presenting today of independent genesis. For that, so comets, for instance, such as this one, may have borne basically elements or bacteria from one solar system to another. However, this is very unlikely. The arguments are as follows. If something, in order to get life space born, one needs an impact. So you need a large impact, and life needs to survive that. Then it needs to survive in space, and then that rock needs to leave that particular place, which is really hard without its own source of energy. Then it needs to survive travel, and then survive the second impact, and then land in the right environment, otherwise it would not thrive. The distance between stars is such that this is very unlikely. However, as I said, as long as we have only one example, it's very hard to rule this out. What most people think is that actually life is pretty easy to do, and this is well illustrated by a series of experiments and discoveries. One of them is the Miller array experiment. Those researchers put in this balloon a representation of what they thought was a representation of the early atmosphere. They put water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, lit the electric arc that you see, simulating essentially thunderstorms, lightning in the early Earth atmosphere. And after a day, there was a soup of organic molecules within which 20 amino acids had been produced. And life uses 22 on Earth, 20 very frequently, but 22 in overall. This was seen that the early or most basic elements of life, those that are needed to build the DNA molecule and most of the proteins that our body require, are actually pretty easy to produce. However, do you need to do them on Earth? And a counter-argument came in 1969 when the Murchison meteorite crashed in Australia. It was collected very quickly and has almost no Earth contamination. You see in this test tube here, this was a bit of the rock that was dissolved and centrifugated. And in that, 14,000 chemical compounds were identified, amongst which 70 amino acids. That's 50 that have an extraterrestrial origin. Does it mean that panspermia is real? Actually not. So amino acids are some of those molecules that have what we call chirality. Chirality is this property that, for instance, our hands have. They're symmetrical, but you cannot overlay them. And some molecules exist in the left and the right hand side of chirality. Life on Earth, somehow, only chose the left-hand side. It's only for practical reasons, so that you can match one molecule to the other. However, on this molecule and in the Miller experiment, both chirality actually are shown, showing that actually those were produced biologically, so geologically or just chemically. This means, I think, that the universe can actually build the basic elements of life very easily. But how do they combine to create life? Well, there is actually a big mystery, because we still do not know. Some people have thought of a special place on Earth, but now I think most people tend to seeing the Earth more as a global entity, a global chemical reactor where different locations on Earth serve to create very different part of life. The DNA may have emerged at one location, then moved on to create, for instance, the lipidic cell around it to protect it, requiring different pH and heating conditions. What most people don't know is that there is a considerable amount of exchanges of fluids within the atmosphere, within the crust, and within the oceans of the Earth. Plus, a lot of energy can be inputted thanks to impacts of volcanism, the tides as well. So we will leave it at that. This is still a mystery, and that's where astronomy tries to help. If life is very frequent, if every planet essentially that could have life essentially has it, then it means that the chemical reactions leading to life emerging on Earth must be very mundane, that the environment actually has nothing special. However, if we find that few planets have it, then we will have to consider more exotic reactions, more exotic places, maybe even panspermia. So after this introduction, one may wonder what are we looking for, really? What will other life be like? Will it be like that of the Earth? And for that, there was a certain amount of debate that has now been actually kind of bridged. Astronomers and biologists differed in how they perceived life elsewhere. Astronomers traditionally thought that pretty much everything is possible, that there is no special place in our universe, that life is pretty diverse and we expect the same diversity. We have very diverse environments expected in other planets, and there is no reason to think that one biological process should be preferred compared to another. However, biologists think otherwise. Although what gives root to evolution is random, whether one gene will be created versus another, evolution is convergent. It means that whether that gene will be propagated is not part of randomness. What biological systems do is evolve towards the most efficient state. Say, you want to see something, you need something round because you need a lens to focus the light. And about 80 branches in a tree of life have actually evolved an eye differently. This means that we have actually a debate. For instance, does photosynthesis work on another planet? Imagine that the Earth, for instance, is around the sun, which emits most of its light in what we see, the visible light. But other stars, for instance, will emit most of their light into the infrared, which we feel on our skin as heat. So will photosynthesis adapt to visual light, to infrared light, or will it not? So we will actually see that, whether this is the case or not. In essence, the error that most biologists did was not consider that environments can be radically different elsewhere. And we astronomers had forgotten about convergence and how life can actually help converge towards a particular desirable trait. So let's see how photosynthesis works as a quick recap. So plants have chloroplast in their cells, and they gather light, which they use as their source of energy to transform water and CO2 into what they need, proteins essentially, and energy that I've written as sugar. And they release a waste, which we breathe, called oxygen. This type of waste actually is what we look for as astronomers. We call them biomarkers. So oxygen is a very good one. It's a light gas that rises very high up in the atmosphere, can be transformed into ozone, which is another gas that we're looking for. Methane and CO2 that we breathe, that we expire, for instance, are also biomarkers. Every smell that you have in a forest or in a burger shop, so to speak, are actually biomarkers, but those are pretty heavy molecules and will remain near the surface, so no chance to detect them, at least so far. So will this process work elsewhere? So on Earth, it looks like that. So you have a tree, the leaves are pretty dark, and the sky is pretty bright. This is a mundane sight. However, if you turn on your near-infrared vision, say that your skin could see very sharp images, the same image in a near-infrared essentially looks like this. This is actually something that photographers like to do. It gives this kind of shining image to trees. So what used to be dark is now bright, and the sky, you see, is completely black. And that's because water absorbs most of the light that is in the sky. So plants actually have no use for infrared radiation on Earth. They actually reflect it, and that's why the tree is so bright. They reflect it, they don't need it. They use it actually to cool down. So imagine that tree now on a planet around a star that emits most of its light in a dark sky. Will actually life use photosynthesis? And for that, we need to go back to how photosynthesis actually emerged on Earth. And we have to go pretty deep. What people think now is that photosynthesis actually evolved in the darkest of places, where there was almost no light, inside the oceans. How it emerged is thought that early organisms living off, for instance, chemicals in order to have their own energy source and build a protein, survive and replicate, needed to find where those were. And those are released, notably, for instance, in vents in a deep part of the ocean. And those are essentially hot places, so they needed an infrared sensor, essentially. And that's how photosynthesis worked. It basically was used to detect where they were, where food was. And progressively, as those organisms moved to the surface, they discovered the sun and then changed from infrared to actually visible light. So there is nothing that precludes actually that particular phenomenon to occur on another planet, and it's one that we're actually looking for. We're actually expecting eventually to detect oxygen. To show the remarkable adaptability of this process, I will only show this. This is a sea slug. It's an animal that is actually native to Canada. You can find it in Nova Scotia. And this actually eats algae and extracts a chloroplast and can live off photosynthetically for 4 to 6 months without any food. Just live off the sun. Imagine that. Wouldn't that be something pretty cool? You just need to go for lunch on the beach. So actually, we actually calculated how big of an area or how much time you needed to do that. Can you kind of guess? No, anyone? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it would take more than a day to get all the energy that we require. So we would need a huge appendage. That would be also pretty cool. Anyway, so photosynthesis is not for us. We leave it to the slugs. So I want to show you another example of the remarkable adaptability of life. And for that, I have one simple organism. It's a tardigrade, otherwise called as a water bear. It's actually pretty common. You just need to take a comb and go on the moss, and you will find some. They're about 0.5 millimeter in size. And you can see them with a cheap microscope. Those are actually pretty cool. So if you desiccate them, if you bring them in a dry environment, they actually will get rid of 98% of their own water. And that gives them, that leads them into a hibernating state that we call a ton. And in that state, they can survive boiling water, freeze, outer space for a few days, pressure 6 times deeper than the deepest trenches. 6 times more important than the deepest trenches, and they can survive also without food, no water for about 10 years. Imagine. That's also pretty cool. And that's all a piece of luck. They really wanted to survive droughts, but it just happened that that trait is also useful elsewhere where they would never have imagined they would end up in. You can actually try that at home. So the only thing one needs to do is actually put them back to room temperature and put a bit of water and they will revive. So those are not extremophiles. They do not live in weird places. They only survive it, so to speak. We also have on Earth other organisms that actually live in the deepest mines, in the deepest oceans, inside volcanoes, hot springs. Some have survived in space also and in nuclear reactors. So once life has started, in other words, it's very hard to get rid of it. And that's really what we hope as astronomers, that the universe is a pretty violent place, and one of the last AstroTour, we had actually a very good demonstration of that. But if life emerges somewhere, it actually may very well survive whatever you throw at it. Notably the late heavy bombardment. So maybe life did emerge very early on Earth. So now that we have those clues, that we're pretty confident, that we could use biological systems as we know them on Earth, that we have this assurance that life will survive, where do we search? Where will we search for it? So one of the first places, one actually that people had wondered for a while, is actually Earth itself. I mentioned already, maybe life still, if it's easy to make, maybe still, there is a new genesis occurring as we speak. That's what biologists refer to as weird life. It would be something that is structurally different from our own. However, we think that Earth is a pretty bad place to look for it, sadly. We'll have to move elsewhere. The reason is that early organisms didn't know predation. They only lived off what was in a basically water, the chemicals that they had at their disposal. However, as the population grew, resources became scarce, and someone decided that it was better off eating its neighbor. Since we're actually very good predators ourselves, we know that life has evolved in a direction, and so any weird life or new generation would actually not have that character and be seen as food by anything else. So if it does happen, it's actually wiped out immediately. So we have to look for weird life somewhere else. And one such place is, for instance, Europa. This is a satellite around Jupiter. It's covered in ice, but below the ice there is an ocean, a salty, warm ocean. And we see that because the ice is cracked. And the red pigmentation here is actually that salt that comes back to the surface. However, we have an issue there that, okay, maybe weird life could happen here, but we would not have evidence of an independent genesis. We also have a problem that we cannot go deep. We cannot go through this ice layer. It's about 1 to 10 kilometers thick. The reason why we would not be sure of an independent genesis is that rocks can actually travel throughout the solar system, and notably, the asteroid that landed or crashed at about the time that the dinosaurs disappeared may have thrown enough rocks that about 2 kilograms of it reached Jupiter's orbit. So maybe the Earth has contaminated Europa. Maybe Europa has contaminated the Earth in the past, or a third place, to both our places. And then there is the fact that bacteria actually do resist in space. So if we do land in an ocean, I think we actually may contaminate it ourselves. Another good place is similar to Europa, but a bit further afield, around Saturn. This is Enceladus. It also has an ocean. It's not the entire undersea cover that is, but just a location. And you see those geysers here. This is basically water that is being thrown by heat into space. It transforms into ice. So there are plans actually to go and collect this material, trying to see whether any organic compounds exist in it. But again, this may only show something that is similar to us. We need to find something different. And Saturn has another of those satellites. But again, it's not a satisfying answer. This is Titan. Titan has a very cold surface. It's about 170 below zero over there. And what you see is a lake. It's a lake, but not of water, of methane. So what we use to basically cook, over there they use to swim in. There's actually a plan to run a boat on these things. So, we could imagine that life on Earth uses water as a substrate, that maybe a weird life would use methane as a substrate. This is good because we cannot contaminate that. Life on Earth, although could survive, would not replicate. So we would be pretty sure that actually didn't emerge from Titan as well. However, cold temperatures also mean reactions are very slow. So we do not expect much life on Titan either. And this forces us to turn elsewhere. Another reason to turn elsewhere is, again, this question of independence and how often does life emerge. And for that, we need a large sample. We need to see many planets. And that's where we go to exoplanets, those that orbit other stars than the Sun. We know so many planets, and we're about to find so many more, that even if life is hard to emerge, then we should eventually find it. Or place, at the very least, a very, very constraining limit on its occurrence. This means that we would have a good idea which scenario is plausible. It can inform the debate about the processes that we think led to the emergence of life here. We also can answer other questions that we wonder. Do we need plate tectonics, for instance, for life to emerge? Some people think so. Do we need a moon? After all, we're the only small planet with a big moon and life on it. Do we need the planet to rotate? So say that some planets, for instance, like the moon, around the Earth always shows the same face. Some planets may always show the same face to their star. Is that a requirement that the planet should have a day and night or not? How much water do we need? The Earth is actually pretty dry. It's akin to putting an orange in a bucket and just drying it. That's very little water, but could you need more? Could you need less? Which temperature range as well are important. We could also study the present, but also the past and the future. Observe a young star, you have a young Earth. Observe an old star, you have an old Earth. And try to see what happens to life after it's been here for tens of billions of years, or see it right at emergence and try to see and assess how quickly does it emerge. Exoplanets have another thing. They're very diverse. This is one plot. This is one of two plots, I think, that are important to understand. Let me think. So what we see here are the current discoveries. It's actually pretty updated. We have here the period in years. So this is 1 year. The Earth would be somewhere down below here. That's 10% of a year, so 36.5 days, a bit more than a month. And this is 3.6 days, 10 years. Here we have mass. Those are Jupiter, 1 times the mass of Jupiter. We have Jupiter here, 11 years, 1 times its mass, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. 10% of the mass of Jupiter, 1% of the mass of Jupiter. What you see here is systems the size of Jupiter at 3-day orbit, something just shy of Neptune on 3-day orbit. Mercury would be about this period, but much below in the diagram. We see those guys here, the mass of Jupiter, but instead of the Earth. Those planetary systems are very different from our own. The reason why there is nothing here is not that there is nothing, but rather that we haven't detected yet. It takes a while for planets to rotate. So say you need 2 rotation period to detect a planet. To detect Jupiter, it takes 20 years. And basically, it's 20 years since the first discovery this year. So we're reaching out. It's also hard to find lower mass planets. So although we do not know what's here, we know what's here. And we know that about 65% of the stars that you see in the night sky have something different than the solar system. In fact, half of them have something very weird, those things that we call super-Earth, something that is between the mass of Neptune and that of the Earth. And those are below the orbit of Mercury. So they have something quite big that we do not have in the solar system. And we're coming to the conclusion that the solar system did not participate in the main mechanism of planet formation in our galaxy. It does not mean it's very special, but it is a bit special. That's one thing. The other interest is that we have very different environments being given to us. We have a diversity of orbital periods, as you can see, of irradiation. So those planets will be very hot, those will be very cold. We have different eccentricity, so some orbits are circular, others will be very elliptic, changing the temperature radically across the year. Some planets orbit double stars. So we'll have 2 suns. Some have very weird climates depending on whether they face always the same hemisphere towards their star or not. This means that we can actually study all those, although we will start with those that probably sustain water. We want to know and search for what we already have an idea for. Then, once we have found life elsewhere, maybe we can turn to those more diverse environments and find odd behavior, maybe indicative of alternate biologies. So I will do a quick advertisement. So the IAU, the International Astronomical Union, wants to name exoplanets, and for that it needs your help. So astronomical associations have been called to actually propose names, and now the public, if you want to click on this, can actually start voting. So that starts in August, I believe. Go to nameexoworlds.org. So if you haven't had time to take a picture of that, it comes at the end of the talk. So don't worry too much. All right, let's go to the next slide. So another important concept in exoplanets to understand is the habitable zone, which is one that has been pretty well popularized. So we have here the sun and the inner solar system. And this green area here is more or less where if we were to place the Earth, it would still retain water in the liquid phase. And that's what we define as the habitable zone, the capacity of a planet to retain liquid water. So place the habitable zone in the solar system is between about the orbit of Mars and that of Venus. So we know Venus and Mars are not habitable, so already the chance, it seems, is 1 in 3, and maybe the odds are rarer. Place our solar system around a hotter star, and you see that this green zone moves a bit further out. Place it around a colder star, and it moves closer in. And that's what we call actually an opportunity. Here, it takes a year to go around, which takes a while to discover and a while to study. Here, it takes about a week. So we'll go for those ones. Also, what happens is that those stars are pretty small, which allows us to actually find smaller planets more easily, notably through this technique. This is the transit technique. This is a video that was captured while Venus was transiting. We see here the sun, so this is all real. And this is exactly what we will try to discover. And that's what most of my work is, trying to find those transiting planets. The planet casts a shadow, hiding a bit of the starlight, and we try to discover these small dimmings that are periodic in time that will basically yield the presence of a planet. For that, we're actually building a new observatory in Chile. Those are 4 telescopes of 1 meter. They will survey the smallest stars that exist, because around the smallest stars we can actually find something the size of the Earth pretty easily. And every week, those planets will pass in front of the star, and while they pass in front of the star, we can study their atmospheres and peek into it. If we were to look for the same around solar-like stars, we would need maybe 15 years to find out an answer, whereas here we would need maybe a year before we have an idea of what's inside the atmosphere. So we've gone a long way already, right? We've looked at how life was, we've looked at how it could evolve elsewhere, at actually what are exoplanets and whether what we could hope to find. But now what are we really looking for? What actually will show us the evidence for another biology? That's the next chapter. And for that we will have to go into understanding spectroscopy, just briefly, to understand how we actually get our data. So this was made famous by a rock band. However, the original author is much older. You have here white light being dispersed by a prism. And if you put a telescope at the backside of this, so usually we have a telescope here to focus the light on this, but then we put a small telescope on the backside, then we blow up that rainbow, and that's what we see. That's the sun. The way to read this picture is to go from the left and get to the right and move one side down and then continue. It's essentially a big rainbow that has been stacked up in bits because we couldn't fit it otherwise. And you see that some colors are missing. You know, there's a clear lack of red here, a bit of yellow is missing, lots in the blue. And that's because some atoms actually take up that light. Those exist in the atmosphere of the sun, which has a very tenuous atmosphere, but some also in the atmosphere of the Earth. So we will transform this into a new picture, one that I will use more frequently, this one. So you see here lots of light, and here less light. Here, where the dark bands exist, that's basically where there is less light, essentially. So everything that goes down is where there is less light. And the way we know what's there, for instance, that's oxygen, that's hydrogen, that's sodium, magnesium. The reason why we know that is because we can do it in the lab. And that's a constant. It's universally right. So for instance, if we look at hydrogen, it emits light here in the red, and when it's hot and when it's cold, it actually captures the light. And we see it here in the blue as well. If we add something on top, so we get the hydrogen and the sodium, then we get that light. And you see that where it's missing in our lab, it's actually there. And we build up this thing so that we can recreate this code bar. For instance, magnesium here. Now, one thing that isn't in the sun is this one. That's actually caused by the atmosphere of the Earth, because the sun rays go through the atmosphere and will hit some oxygen molecule, which will hide it, capture that particle of light. And so that oxygen will actually capture something. That's how we actually will do the technique that we will use to infer the presence of oxygen elsewhere. So how will we do that practically? How will we move essentially from observing this to actually knowing? And for that, I will use an example very, very near to us. Notably, can we actually, if we were to place a spectrograph on these dots here, know that there is life on Earth? Can we detect ourselves? We already know the answer, and that's the easy one, right? Well, you can point at the moon, actually. So the moon was used as a kind of big mirror in space in order to find that out. And during a lunar eclipse, and there is one end of September, so we all expect you to come back. We have here the moon during a lunar eclipse is blood red, and the reason why it's so red is because the sun, the Earth, and the moon are in perfect configuration. The only sun rays that reach the moon have had to go through the atmosphere of the Earth. So they have had to be transformed by the atmosphere of the Earth. So has anyone actually wondered what it looked like on the moon while we were taking that picture? Anyone? No? So that actually was imagined in 1937. So this is what looks like a lunar eclipse seen from the moon. This is a total eclipse of the sun by the Earth, and the only light that reaches is this ring of fire here. Essentially the southern sunrises and sunsets, the only light that reaches the moon. So that's a picture. The photograph was recently taken by the Japanese Space Agency. You see here a series of 5 photographs as a probe, a satellite, was around the moon, and the Earth is rising as the satellite orbits towards it, and it was taking the pictures. And we see here, this is our atmosphere, essentially. So this is what illuminates the moon. So let's take the moon and put an instrument on it. What do we see? That's what we see. So remember, lots of light here, not so much light when you have something like that. And basically, that's oxygen. Here we have ozone. Here we have water. That's basically trying to detect the marks of life from the moon, essentially from space. We can actually trick it another way. I don't know if some of you have noticed, but sometimes when the moon is supposed to be dark, it's not exactly dark. That's what we call the Earth shine. So the Earth shine, when the moon is not entirely dark, you see here there's the crescent, so it's really a new moon. It happens when some sunlight gets to the Earth, bounces back into space in every direction, but some of it is stopped by the moon, and for some reason, some of it bounces back to us, and then we observe it, say in Chile, where I often go. And when we analyze that residual light, essentially, what we see is the following. And you see here, this is much stronger. What we see is water, methane, carbon dioxide. We see ozone as well, but we also see the presence of vegetation. And that's because the trees reflect in the infrared. So here is the visible light, and here is the infrared light. And the trees absorb that part because they take it to make photosynthesis, and they reject the rest. And so this is brighter here. So we can actually know that there is vegetation on Earth. Satisfying, right? We are saved.
Just
Yep.
pointing your telescope at the moon and detecting light.
That's right, yes. So what we see is actually the light from the sun transformed by the atmosphere of the Earth bounce back off the moon, really as a mirror. Try to see the Earth from far, but it's easier to have the instrument on the ground than in space. So how do we apply this to exoplanets, essentially? So we will apply it to something that we call transmission spectroscopy. That happens while the planet transits the star, and you see this ring of fire here. So essentially, this is what we want to find. This is our signal. The problem is that instead of having the sun or the star completely blocked by the moon, we have that problem. We're kind of lost in there. It's tiny, tiny signal. So how do we recover it? Fortunately, we have a bit of a trick. That's a quick slide. So here is the Earth and the sun. Imagine that you're on the moon here. The reason why a lunar eclipse is red is because the red light goes through the atmosphere of the Earth pretty easily. So it gets pretty close to the Earth's surface and reaches you. So if you were to measure the size of the Earth, you would measure it about that size. Now if you were to measure it in blue, because most of the sunlight, when it reaches the atmosphere of the blue light, is scattered, giving rise to a nice blue skies. Then the blue light, you see those rays here, will be stopped in the atmosphere, and so they never reach you here. So you will have only to see the sun rays that goes at a bigger planet, and so you will see something that is bigger in the blue. And that's what we are attempting to do. So right now, a number of people are doing this. This is a technique that is actually at work, not on Earth-sized planet, but on Jupiter-sized planet. That's what the data looks like. And actually, at the moment, the only thing we see is flat. It's cloudy over there. So we've tried another technique. That's emission spectroscopy. It's when the planet goes behind the star. So imagine you don't see where the planet is exactly. You see the combined light. You have the star and a planet. So you see both, reflected light, emitted light from the planet and from the star. And then it hides behind, and you only see the starlight. So in practice, this works like this. You have here star plus planet light, starlight, you see is a bit dimmer, and star plus planet light. And you see that this is getting bigger as it gets redder, right? Boom. And that's basically what we recreate. So this object, for instance, is a gas giant, and we can study how much carbon there is compared to oxygen, and we can study how the pressure and the temperature evolve vertically in the atmosphere. And that's what we hope to do one day for Earth-like planets. So we're training essentially on gas giants. That technique is my favorite. However, it doesn't give you anything about geography, right? We know that the Earth has very diverse locations. So can we do that? And actually, we can transform that and map planet, really make a map. For that, we will have to go to another concept. That's what we call a phase curve. That's exactly like the phases of the moon. When a planet orbits around the star, sometimes its crescent will be small and sometimes it will be big. And so that will change the amount of light that we will receive. Essentially, the data looks like that. So here we have the sunlight, essentially, and boom, planet passes in front of the star. That's how we detect it. Whoop, it comes back in there. And here is the night side, so we don't see much, anything. And then it turns, and so the crescent comes into view, and you see it's getting brighter. And boom, behind the star. What we notice here, it's slightly brighter here before this occultation than afterwards. And this curve essentially allows us to recreate a map, a one-dimensional map, meaning that we have only information on that axis, but not on that one. And when we found out, it was hotter at tea time, not at midday. The reason for that is actually a lot of wind goes through. It's the same as on the Earth, essentially. The heat gets redistributed towards later in the afternoon, although midday is supposed to be right when we're below the sun. So we have one way to basically measure what's inside the atmosphere, the abundance in the atmosphere, and one way to map it. Can we combine both? And actually, that has been done last year for the first time. So you're in luck. So this is a bit complex. Don't worry too much. Here, there are 3 times the planet at different color. So color 121, 142, 163 in the infrared. And you will see that water basically prevents light from emerging. So it's going to be darker in the middle one. And basically, this is what the data really looks like. And you see that those numbers correspond here. 1.6 here, 1.2 here. And this is where water is. So you'll see that there will be less light in that white area. And so we see the planet move along. And see, it's darker here compared to here. So we know that on the day side of that planet, there is water in the atmosphere. Isn't that incredible? But that's, again, only one-dimensional, right? What about that axis? Can we not do something else? And fortunately, a bright PhD student at MIT came up with the answer. So that's happened also while the planet goes behind the star. As the planet is being hid by the star, it will first hide this part of the planet, then that part, 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 as the planet progresses into the other side. And as it moves on the other side, it reappears. It will first reappear here, and then here, and then here, and then here. And you see that this creates a latitude and a longitude. And so you can recreate, actually, and do a 2-dimensional map, essentially, of a planet. The first has been done, but it looks exactly like the 1D map. Bad luck. So we'll try it again, I promise. But now we have all the tools, and essentially we have everything. The techniques are there. We're about to find the planets. We're about to send the right telescope. And hopefully soon we'll be able to know where is life and where is actually particularly vegetation. Know this area compared to that area, water, and differentiate all that. So I hope I've convinced you that we are on a good path to answer one of the most fundamental questions. We're not there yet. It's going to take a couple of decades, probably more, but soon. We're getting there, and I'm pretty optimistic about it. So while I take your question, I'll put that back so you know and can vote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amaury, for that talk. We have about 5 minutes for questions. I'm sure you're burning with them. We'll take 3 questions. Well, I think we have time for 4 questions. Would you like to take?
Who? Yes?
What role does extinctions play on another planet's journey through its life cycle?
Extinction, you mean like biological extinctions? Oh.
Yeah, like there have been on Earth, there's been several of them.
Yeah, several of them. So, let's say...
Is that part of your equation or of your research at all?
It's a bit remote, but one could imagine. I mean, I don't think most of vegetation actually was suppressed. So I don't really know, so to speak. But I don't think it would prevent much. I think most of life, as we know, after each extinction has actually... So one of the burning question also about life on Earth is whether we need Jupiter. For instance, Jupiter can shield us from asteroids or comets impacting the Earth, but it also sends some our way. But we know that every extinction has also been beneficial, although not for the people living then. So most species collapsed, but then they recovered more quickly than they actually were before. So actually maybe we emerged, like 4.5 billion years afterwards, but maybe a bit late because we got Jupiter. So every argument in that equation can go forward, like in favor of helping life or in disfavor. We don't know really. Yes? Sorry.
So far what you're detecting is actually the environment.
Yes.
But that doesn't prove that there is life.
Yes, it's going to be a hard thing. So what we try to show is, for instance, oxygen cannot remain in a very large quantity in the atmosphere for very long. So there is a bit of oxygen on Mars, for instance, but something like 0.1% of the atmosphere is composed of oxygen. And that's done geologically. But at a 21% level, actually, we don't think it's possible. The oxygen would react. We know it reacts very well. Combustion uses oxygen, so it would react with the surface and disappear from the atmosphere. So we hope that by using such a gas, we actually would have a reliable marker that something is replenishing constantly with newer oxygen. So although it's not conclusive proof, it's good evidence. Yes. Yes. If we find only one planet with that, we may actually wonder. If we find 10,000 like that, then actually we'll be pretty confident.
But is life only carbon-based?
That we do not know either.
That's what.
But that should not actually preclude any of the photosynthesis. So, question? Yes?
So if we could see oxygen on other worlds, then theoretically life elsewhere can see our oxygen.
Presumably.
And know we're here.
Yes.
Is there a theoretical limit for how wide this can be observed?
Depends on how big your telescope and how deep your pockets. We're looking for funding. Yes?
If in the methods for the creation of life on Earth, in the method where life came externally to Earth, where would that life had come from? Where would
Yes. It's a very good question, actually. Is why also I don't like that other explanation, because it doesn't tell us how it emerges in the first place. So it comes from somewhere else, but then we would not know how it emerges in the first place. Does that answer your question?
do you know where if that method was how life came to Earth, then what would have been the transportation?
Probably a comet, something like this. It's the most widely used medium. Yeah. An asteroid would do. I think there was a question in the back. Yeah.
This is an extension on that gentleman's question. So all this work is looking at environment which makes life possible. Does all this work kind of drive at an end game where we're relying to send a probe to confirm life, but like light years away? So is there like an end game, end goal? Or is it more of just kind of building the possible?
I think at the moment it's purely curiosity to find out. I think if we achieve the means to send something and we're curious enough, we'll do. But although I'm a very optimistic person, I'm very pessimistic about space travel. It's really, 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 really far away.
One more last
Yes?
question.
Yes?
Okay. Earlier you mentioned a very interesting creature called the tardigrade, or water bear. I was just wondering, from what period are the earliest microfossils of tardigrades found?
I do not know. I'm an astronomer.
Did they first appear in the Cambrian period or pre-Cambrian?
I do not know. I think the water bear lives on the surface, so I would say post-Cambrian. But that's only a guess.
Because to become such hardy creatures, they must have experienced some
Like,
very extreme.
so that was actually the point, not necessarily, in fact. So life is very good at creating traits that then become relevant.
For example, I've heard that tardigrades have a higher immunity to radiation than other.
Yes, they do that but only because they can actually really desiccate their own body, and that's really the key thing. So they manage to do that, become very dry, and survive this. That's the property they evolved, and then it became coincidentally useful in other environments. I mean, I don't think they ever dreamt of going into a nuclear power plant when they evolved it. They just resist to it because they by luck, I guess.
And also if they were on Mars, they would become adapted to radiation because of the thin atmosphere.
We can.
Asteroid hits Mars and the rocks go
I'm sorry to interrupt.
We cannot
but
know
this
that.
sounds like a great conversation.
Yes.
I invite you to come at the end of the lecture to continue it. Unfortunately, we have to move on so that we can get the rest of the night started.
Yes.
I have an announcement. The July AstroTour is cancelled, and the reason for that is we're going to bring you a special event. Thank you. On the 18th of July, it's at 7 p.m. It's on a Saturday, and we're inviting a keynote speaker from Victoria, and she's going to be giving a special lecture, and there'll be special receptions and all that. More information will come on our website very soon. But don't turn up in the first week of July here, because there will be no talk. For those of you who have planetarium booked at any of those following times, please turn up to the meeting point 5 minutes earlier. The meeting point is in front of the elevators there. That's what it looks like. And to get there, you just walk that way. For those of you who do not have planetarium shows, there is observing upstairs. The night looks quite clear today, so I invite you up to have a look. Then finally, as you came into the door, you would have been given a feedback form. We would love to hear back from you and see how we went today. To bribe you, as usual, cookies. Not only cookies, today we also have some postcards.